And we are back on Build Phase TV. I'm your host, Mr. Ben, and today we are going to be taking a look at some Radlands action. Now, on the left-hand side of the board, we have Team Build Phase member Thrawn, and on the right-hand side of the board, we have Whitman. Because both these guys are part of our local group here, we were able to get them together to play an in-person match for the Welcome to the Radlands event. Now, we did use two separate draw piles so that there's still the same number of cards. It treats everything exactly as if we were playing over webcam. The other thing to note is this game has already been underway for a little bit. I said, hey guys, let me set up the camera to record this, and they had already started playing. So I believe we missed the first turn of the game, but we're getting into it now, and we'll be here till the end. All right, so Wit threw a junk to bombardment. He probably should have technically given himself his water before he started junking cards, but he junked a bombardment to heal his Juggernaut. So spending 2 water to draw a card here. Now, if I'm in a position where this early in the game my opponent is spending water to draw cards, that tells me they probably have a weak hand. A little bit of a waffle on which column to put the wounded soldier into. Wow, this is a strong turn 2 from Whitman here. I believe he junked the assassin there, so we were a little bit limited by camera angle. But he junked a card that let him get the raid out, and I think it was the assassin. Oh. Whitman is having... Okay, so Whitman pulled a little takesy-backsies there, and instead of paying 2 to draw a card, he paid 2 to hit the camp using the looter, which then allows him to draw a card. So it puts... Everything ends up in the same place, except Whitman now gets to also put some damage out there. Generally speaking, in competitive play, it's always up to the discretion of the players at the table. If a player wants to allow somebody to do a little takesy-backsies, that's totally fine, as long as both players are okay with it. In general, I would encourage people to not need to rely on rewinding turns, though, particularly in a competitive environment. To be fair, Whitman is 10, though. All right, so John's raid goes off here. Then he draws a card. Whitman's going to take that damage into his Oasis. So at the start of the turn here, we basically have a tie game. Both players have 1 damaged camp. But Whitman has a much stronger board at this point. So if you're in John's position, there's a couple of things you want to do. One, you want to start putting some counter pressure on the opponent's people. If these 3 people, while they themselves may not be super threatening with any of these powers, as soon as somebody like Mulger or one of the other legendaries comes down into hand behind one of these other characters, well, now you have a big problem. You know, the difference between Varavosh needing 2... now, Gunner is a great answer for this board state. It's going to let him take away some of... Why are you being so confusing with your water chips, John? Oh, nope, he's taking it back too. Oh, okay. Little bit of a sequencing error there from John. So he's spending 2 water to destroy his reactor and KO all of Whitman's people. So that does get him out of this situation at a pretty significant cost. I mean, that's 20% of his total hit points for the game. And now an assassin comes down, as well as a gunner. So things have flipped somewhat significantly here. When Whit passed his last turn, he had three people in play, looking at an empty board, and now John has almost totally flipped that around with two people in play. Whitman's got an empty board, although the damage numbers are no longer showing parity. All right, so Whitman's truce is going to clear off the gunner and assassin from John's side of the board. Should probably do a little water cleanup there too. So if you're in Whitman's position, you've got the heal on your outpost. So if you're worried about your oasis, you can stand it back up. But I think I would be a little more inclined to start taking advantage of the oasis as a camp. Let's get a person out of our hand into play at a discounted rate, hopefully free. All right, so he ended up going with the holdout. So this is 2 turns in a row where John looked down a kind of intimidating board state, completely cleaned it up, and was able to develop. And then Whitman cleaned up a intimidating board state and admittedly developed a little less, but the holdout is quite an effective damage dealing card. All right, so the heal bot, as it comes into play, is going to be able to restore the railgun on John's side. He's going pretty heavy on trying to protect that railgun, which I suppose between the two, I care more about the card that's going to let me deal some damage than I care about the card that's going to let me heal. One of those prevents you from losing. One of those helps you win. The damage onto the Atomic Garden came when Whitman's raid resolved there at the start of turn. Now, if I'm a holdout, you almost have to use the holdout's ability to deal damage on that heal bot. It feels pretty bad because that leaves you easily just right picking for the gunner. But, I mean, the healing just feels so bad if they start to get away with it. That said, there's not that much to heal on John's side, so maybe you hit the gunner now, force him to spend the water to use the heal bot to pick the gunner back up if he wants to get value out of it. I think a real key here, though, if you're sitting on Whitman's side of the board, is you need to put some pressure out there. All right, so Junking Bombardment, the most powerful event in the game, and that gets Whitman back up to full health compared to John, who is at 50%. One camp gone, one camp damaged. Unfortunately, this camera angle doesn't let me see how many cards are in each player's hands, and I have not been keeping track. So I don't know how deep the resources, given that John's had a couple of turns now where he's put several characters out on the board. Yeah, the truce put him back in his hand, so he's able to play the same characters more than once, but still, that's a lot of threats deployed. I can't imagine his hand is very deep at this point. All right, the assassin destroys the holdout. I mean, if you're on John's side of the board, you have to be feeling pretty good about the character development right up until that fallout went off and forces him to destroy every card but one, every person but one. So Whitman is ahead on the health here. Injuring the heal bot with a junk from hand and then having to again spend 2. Oh my goodness. So Whit drew 2 cards that let him put injuries onto the heal bot and has once again wiped John's board. But at what cost? With him paying 2 water more or less every turn to try to fund his hand, there's going to come a point where he's going to draw cards that aren't going to be cheap enough that he can play them in the same turn. So I think it's a good call on Whitman's part to advance the Juggernaut there. For anybody not familiar with the Juggernaut, if he's able to use its ability 3 times, it out and out destroys one of John's camps. Now, the thing about the Juggernaut, though, is everybody knows how scary it is, and it takes a long time to get where it's going. So often, I think 100% of my experience using it it has ended up not getting where it was going. So not to throw John under the bus here, but I don't like that. If you're gonna water silo, grab the extra water chip. There you go. Use them to count correctly so people know what's going on. That's one thing I do really like about Radlands in general is all of the bookkeeping, all of the accounting for I paid for this guy is or isn't ready. It's all handled in game. There's no because you're not given the ability to turn a card sideways to indicate not being ready, which is a tool that's used in many, many other games. But because a card being sideways in Radlands means that it's damage, it's a way of tracking hit points as opposed to readiness. They had to do something else, and to his credit, Daniel did, and that is the water chip economy. And not only using them as currency, but using them as counters. So we have a return famine here. I think I called that Fallout before, but that card's called Famine. And you have to think about this famine play as a disincentive. Obviously, John is not able to... Whitman doesn't have any cards in play, so John is not trying to deal with a threat that's already on the board. But what a famine play here can effectively do is force your opponent to not develop, to take a turn doing something other than developing to the board. And that's exactly what happened. Whitman used his whole turn just to push the Juggernaut up, and no people come into play. So before John even drew that card, technically that event should have resolved. Still hasn't resolved his event. No! Oh, okay. Whitman called him out. So... Yeah, and honestly, that's a fair point of confusion. If an ability has no cost, can I just go ahead and use it? Did John just damage his cannon to use the cannon's ability? Whoa. So I was home when this when this game took place, but I think... I'm not sure why John's cannon got damaged there. Yep, so Heal and Juggernaut is going to destroy one of the camps. Opting to give up the cannon. Okay, so whether the cannon should or shouldn't have been in a damaged state there, I think that might have been a, hey, I play other card games kind of mistake where I'm going to use this ability, so he exhausted the card. But sideways doesn't mean exhausted in Radlands. But even if that card was fully stood up, the Juggernaut still would have destroyed it, so it ended up being completely moot with regard to how the gameplay plays out. Whitman's reminding John to get his Muse water. So I can see here that John has Doomsayer in hand. This is actually a super relevant pickup for this moment in time because he can push that raid off. And because that raid is down there on event track 3, it potentially means that Doomsayer is going to be able to use his pay 1 water, deal 1 damage as long as your opponent has an event on the track power. Whereas in many situations, if your opponent knows the Doomsayer is coming, they're just not going to play events. They're not going to turn that power on for you. Alright, so John ends up water siloing at the end of his turn. Kind of a weak way to finish the turn, but much better than just letting the water go to waste. Alright, so Whit paid 2 to the outpost to move his raid. So it moved up to 2. Then it moved up to 1 using the outpost, and then he was able to junk a card, which will do the final damage. And that's going to bring us to the end of this game. Apparently, Whitman really wanted everybody to know he had Magnus Carve in his hand there. So this is a game where Juggernaut actually ended up being really relevant. And in Whitman's Week 3 game, it was also a relevant card as him and his opponent had the Juggernaut in the field. All right, so that was Welcome to the Radlands, round 2 between Whitman and Thrawn. Till next time, go win some games.